Good evening, everyone. My name is Isabel. I am the curator here at the Amelia Island Museum of History. I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all. We are thrilled to have you join us for this special evening. Before we open the exhibit downstairs, we are excited to start with a talk by our distinguished speaker, John Hendricks. Just a quick reminder, please make sure your phones are set to silent mode so we can enjoy the presentation without interruptions. Thank you. Before we move on to tonight's presentation, I would like to take a moment to share our upcoming monthly programs here at the museum. In October, for our Grand Bag Lunch, we will be welcoming docent Jonathan Bryan, who will be discussing untold stories of reconstruction on Amelia Island following the Civil War. This will take place on Wednesday, October 2nd at noon. For our next third and third program, we'll have performer, presenter, and storyteller Diane Ford Hall Johnson. She will bring to life the story of Harriet Tubman, woven into the fabric of American history through stories and slave songs. You can find all our upcoming programs in our newsletter, weekly newsletter. If you're not already signed up, please visit our website. You need to scroll down to the very bottom and click the sign up button. Now, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, John Hendricks. John is the president of the West Nassau Historical Society and a lifelong railroad enthusiast. Growing up near Callahan, Florida, his passion for trains and local history led him to earn a degree in construction and design from the University of Florida. He's been actively promoting Nassau County's history, including his 2012 book on Daniel Callahan.
Shameless.
I know, shameless. Just wait at the end of the presentation.
So tonight, John will be exploring the Florida Railroad and its many stops, stations, and junctions in Nassau County during its 170-year existence. Before we begin, and I promise I'm almost done, I would like to thank our sponsors. The program is funded by a grant from Florida Humanities with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We're grateful for their contribution in making this event possible. As part of the grant, you'll be invited to complete a short survey. That's a paper you find on your chair. If you don't have it, we have more on the table, so that you need to complete it at the end of the presentation. So after John's talk and after the survey, we'll open the exhibit downstairs where you can enjoy refreshments and food. With that, please join me in welcoming John Hendricks.
Thank you. Thank you. And y'all are in for a treat, so stick around afterward because we just got a preview of the exhibit and it's very, very, very excellent. So you need to go down there too. I'm John Hendricks, West Nassau Historical Society. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit based in the Callahan Train Depot, and we enjoy working with Isabel on the exhibits, and we enjoy coming to the Amelia Museum to speak. So we're very, very excited. And happy bicentennial, Nassau County, and in a couple months, Fernandina. There we go. So get out your party hats and your whistle. Without further ado, every stop ever, after this presentation, you're going to say, stop! Because I got so many stops. And that's my little homage there to the Twilight Zone Season 1 episode 30 of Stop at Willoughby. It's about a guy who gets on a train and he's really, really not happy with his life. And I won't give all the story away, but he ends up in 1980s Americana. And so it kind of makes you wonder, the conductor of 1880 goes, of course I'm going to use this to Nassau County. Nassau County, July, summer, 1888, peaceful, restful, where a person can slow down to a walk and live their life to full measure. So anybody wants to view that episode, you can. Now, it is a dark episode, so I do warn you. At the end, it is. I mean, it's not one of those feel-good episodes. Anyway, not to spoil it, but we're going to explore the Florida Railroad, and for the first couple of slides, we're going to kind of stress how important the Florida Railroad was, not just to Fernandina or Nassau County or Florida, but to the nation as a whole. It was very important, and I'm fixing to, there you go. Oops, good.
Try again.
Okay, sorry. To the rest of the state, 1930, Florida was just a sparsely populated territory. I think we had, I think Delaware was the only state that had a less population than we did. And of course, nowadays, when you drive down A1A, you think there's probably more people living or driving on A1A than lived in Florida at the time because of the traffic. Anyway, so they had to, in order to ship from the Atlantic coast to the Gulf Coast, they had to go around Key West and what they call the Florida Straits. And that's very, very rough seas. If you know, you got the ocean coming in from the east, and then you got the Gulf coming from the west, and had very, very rough waters, and you had a lot of shipwrecks and a lot of pirates and stuff getting to the shipwrecks. And they had to come up with a better way. So y'all have heard of David Yulee, okay? And he came up with an idea to come up with a Florida Railroad, and he wanted to connect the Atlantic coast with the Gulf in order to bypass the Florida Straits. The insurance companies liked the idea. And so they chartered the railroad in 1853. It took a couple of years to get the money and funding. So he was, of course, in the Florida Senate at the time. He was America's first Jewish senator, and he helped Florida pass the Land Improvement Act, Interior Improvement Act, where they would give the railroad a whole bunch of land, and the railroad would sell the land to make money to build the railroad. So, you know, the first obstacle, a lot of people may think that there's nothing past the bridge, but they had to build a bridge off the island. Okay, so that was the first thing, is to hire someone to build the bridge. So in 1855, they hired Daniel Callahan and his partner, Mr. McDowell, to come build the railroad. It took them a year to build it because it was over a mile long at the time. Most of it now has been infilled. But it took them a year to build, and where you have, when you get done, it was a swing span too as well to let the boat traffic come. So, and I mentioned 1855, the improvement fund, and look at that swath of land it was giving. The railroad was giving 12 miles on either side. And if you know the narrowness of the eastern part of Nassau County, that's most of your county on the east side. So if you did not own property in the 1820s or had property by 1855, the state of Florida and the American government owned the land, and it was theirs to give away. So they gave the railroad all that land from Fernandina down to Cedar Key to build a railroad. Well, it went to the railroad, so guess who had the first shot to buy the land? There we go, the people on the railroad. Daniel Callahan, McCrae, other names you're fixing to recognize in a second. But when they decided on Fernandina, because it was already an organization. If you see that second railroad going from Jacksonville westward, there was already a group that wanted to connect the Gulf from Jacksonville. And so Yulee, who lived here, wanted to connect Fernandina. So he started in Fernandina, and he hired, I mentioned, Daniel Callahan to build the bridge. But he said at the time, where was Fernandina at the time? 1855.
Old Town.
Old Town, there you go. In Old Town, you had people owning their property. So they said, well, we can't build the Old Town because of the marshes. So what they did, they said, well, we can come as far as this point here, but no further. So they gridded out a town, the new town of Fernandina, which is the grid you're on now. If you went for David Yulee Railroad, we'd probably the grid that follows the Old Town. So the railroad was very important. So people in the Old Town said, we have to move down here. So for the first couple of miles, they moved down here, and that is probably one of the biggest influences of the Florida Railroad to Nassau County was the movement of Fernandina down to where it is today. And I mentioned the old town right here. That's, of course, now it's West Rock, most of West Rock and the port there. But if you see the swamp there, there's Old Town, there's New Fernandina. So when they mapped out the new grid, which is we have today, Center Street and the streets on the right run east-west, named after trees, and on the left it's named after Florida counties or people, prominent citizens. Broome, there was no county with a B, so they named after Broome. Broome was the Fernandina citizen. He was one of the, during the Civil War. So if you notice some of those names, kind of hard to see, but Daniel Callahan and McCrae, and part of his partner, William Drain. So they got first dibs on the property. So all the ones highlighted in red is lots that Daniel Callahan, he had at least 26 lots that he got from the town, from this railroad, and then he resold it as well. You could probably say, well, did they just say they couldn't build Old Town so they could do this? That's debatable. It is marshy from here to Old Town, so it is debatable. Milepost 0. Now we're going to go, I mentioned Twilight Zone, we're going to go linearly from Milepost 0 to the end of Nassau County. Now the Florida Railroad is 155 miles long. 43 of those miles are in Nassau County, so roughly a quarter of the Florida Railroad falls within Nassau County. As y'all know, Nassau County kind of extends east to west, so it goes east first. So we're going to start with Milepost 0, which is where the original depot was, on the corner of Dade and 2nd Street. It wasn't here where the present Welcome Center is now. And we're going to go from there, and we're going to go linearly, but not by time. So when we get to a certain point, we may be talking about different depots that were at the same spot, but at different times. Okay, so because if you know a community, once they, let's say a sawmill community built on a railroad, and after 20 years they sawed all the trees down, well, that mill town's going to move down the road. And then maybe 20 years later, when the trees came back up, maybe a turpentine still happened. So the community ain't changed. So we're going to do it regardless of time. So here's an 1857 map of Fernandina and an 1884 lithograph showing the location of the original Florida Railroad depot. Building is there as well. You got me. Come here and point. Right there, which is 2nd and Dade Street. You see the railroad kind of curves to the ocean there, and then that's where the yard is there. You can notice the grid covered part of the yard, but they didn't develop it. 1886, 1940. Well, 20 years later, 1886, they decided, well, we can build Old Town. That makes you wonder. The reason why is that is the business in Nassau County was so busy, and trees, and you had the railroad now that you can ship your turpentine to Fernandina, you can ship your lumber from Fernandina, not from Nassau County, but inland. People who'd grown, from Stark and Gainesville could ship their products to Fernandina now, and on the well. So they needed to expand their docks. So all of a sudden they said, hey, well, we can build our railroad up to Old Town. So they started building wharfs here, and there's the remnants of what was left of the wharf. I think it's a 1930 photograph. But they had wharfs up and down from front and center, all up past where the port is now, almost to Old Town. And it lasted about the 1940s when they built the mill there in 38, and all the tracks got pulled up from there. Milepost 1.1, or -1 if you go up from milepost 0. And I love how even today, if you go on Google aerial views, that is right there at the foot of Estrada Street. They're in Old Town on the north, and there's a fence there. There's a little, I guess, a seating area. I noticed that. I haven't been there, but it's pretty neat. But there's a fence there. Of course, this is private property south of there. But you can see the remnants of the old railroad bed right there coming up there, and an old warehouse there at one time. So that was the northernmost point of what was in the Florida Railroad. Now the Florida Railroad, as you see down, and when you get to the exhibit, changed names every 10, 15 years. You had financial difficulties, you had buyouts, you had mergers. So I'm going to use the term Florida Railroad, even though probably in 1886 it was under another name, just to not be confused to everybody. So it's pretty neat on the area view. Thank God for Google Maps and Google Area View on that. And that's a 1950s map that showed the SAL Railroad, which is the Florida Railroad, coming up to that point right there. So we're going back down past the depot there on front and center is now. You had a junction with the Fernandina Amelia Island. Tourism was big in the 1880s and 1890s, and Nassau County, Fernandina. Henry Flagler had not built his railroad yet down to the breakers in St. Augustine and on down to Miami. He didn't reach Miami, I think, until 1896, and didn't reach Key West until 1912, I believe. So still, you had the major tourism was up in the northern part of the state. So he decided to build a railroad down Beach Street from the depot there, moving west to Amelia Island and the beach. That would be Center Street, that line going over to the right there. So it's probably right there. It's Fletcher and Center Street right there with the railroad. There was a big motel there at one time, a hotel, I should say. And even kind of a little thing called Ocean City. And there's the map, Old Town too, actually, is on the map too as well. We're going back from milepost 0 to milepoint 0.8, the depot and railroad yard. The present depot was built after the hurricane in 1898, destroyed the first one. The Florida Railroad yard and warehouses was destroyed by a fire in 1876 and that hurricane of 1898. And then after the hurricane of 1898, the Florida Railroad said no more. They moved their headquarters from Fernandina to Jacksonville. So by 1900, the railroad had moved, the yards had moved. You still had a yard for storage for lumber and turpentine for the docks and stuff. But that kind of started a phase of it from 1900 to about 1930, mid-30ish. Is where kind of like Nassau County went to a little depression a little bit because their major industry had left them. There's pictures of the depot there now, and pictures of the train cars going to the wharf there. And the lower left is a picture after the fire from yesterday's reflections, and the right is a picture of them loading alpha box cars, pulpwood, and probably that's 1950s, I believe. And then we move further down the island and we make the turn to the bridge that Daniel Callahan built. Milepost 4.5, Amelia and Trestle off brand. Like I mentioned, Daniel Callahan built it. It took a year to build. It was over a mile long. The current swing span of the bridge, the metal one, came from Palatka. There was a railroad in Palatka. If you heard of FEC, they had a spur going to crossing the river to Palatka from St. Augustine, and when they took up those tracks, they moved the swing span up from Palatka on a barge to where it is now. The railroad had a really impact on Fernandina, especially during the Civil War, because it made the evacuation of the Confederate troops and the Southern sympathizers a lot easy. And of course, y'all heard about the story about the last train. David Ugley was on the last train, and the Ottawa was there. The Union Ottawa was there and fired cannonballs from it. And I believe there's a picture of that down in not the in the exhibit. So, but and supposedly, now some stories say it missed the car, and some stories say it hit the last car and killed 1 or 2 people. I do not know. But after the Confederates left, after the last train got across, the Confederates took up a lot of the iron and burned the bridge. They didn't want the Union forces to follow them. So throughout, from March of 1862 until the rest of the war, the island was under Union control and the mainland was under Confederate control. I like this picture here because on the lower left, because it shows the old way that you travel by car to Fernandina. Here's the present bridge and there's the present railroad track, but that was the old way. Here's another map here into Fernandina. If you imagine the 20s or 30s when the drawbridge was built, the current where the current bridge is now. Before then, you would have to go down, leaving Fernandina, you go down 8th Street to Bonneview Road and turn right, and that's the way to get off the island. and then you zigzag across Pine Island on the side, and you zigzag south of A1A, and then back up again. It was a zigzag map. But yeah, I love that map there. And there's a picture of the original highway bridge I saw online. I didn't want to use the picture because I didn't have permission, but there is a picture somewhere of the actual first, the bridge, the last bridge, the swing span bridge 2, before they built the new one there. Yeah, Florida Railroad, let's talk pause for a second. It was built, even though we say it was built by Daniel Callahan and his partner, they were only contractors. Labor-wise, it was built by African-American slaves, about 90 to 100 of them, and it was part of Callahan and McDowell's crew, and that's how that was them, and even part of the crew stayed with them after the war to build more. But by 1860, there was 4 stops on the railroad in Nassau County. You had Fernandina, you had Hart's Road, which became Yulee, and you had Callahan, which was called Callahan's Station at that time during the war, and it had a little stop called Louisville, and that was named after Josiah Lewis, and his had a little sawmill, and away from the railroad. And when the railroad was built, he moved his sawmill and his houses and stuff to the railroad track. That's how important the railroad was. And if you weren't part of the railroad, you kind of got bypassed. Well, but there's an 1860 voting, since it's the election year, voting tally. Daniel Callahan did not finish the railroad. He had a dispute with David Yulee in August of '59, 30 miles from Cedar Key, and so what he did, he pulled up his crew and went to Charleston, South Carolina to build another railroad, and that left David Yulee hanging for the last 30 miles. So it took them, the contractor Finnegan said, well, it's no problem, we build it ourselves, but it took them another year to build that last 30 miles, because if you've ever been to Cedar Key, there's a lot of marshes, and ironically, just the other day, they had a fire at Cedar Key. If you haven't heard about that, a couple of buildings burned down there on the ocean. I'm not sure which one, the Rusty Hook or something, so a couple of buildings at Cedar Key burned down just 2 days ago, 3 days ago. So anyway, so it took them another year, and by the time the railroad opened in March of 1861, and I say, oh, nothing can stop us now. We got our Florida Railroad. Well, guess what happened a month later, in April 1861. But don't feel sorry about the railroad, because the railroad kept on going, and instead of passengers and freight, guess what they carried? Supplies and troops. Yep, the train was running. The train carried a lot of the troops onward to other places and stuff. So don't feel sorry for them. Although I guess by the time the end of the war, the money was no good. So you could have had $1 million in Confederate dollars. That didn't do you very much. I mentioned the Civil War. I guess the biggest nice story at the time, for the last 30 years, the county seat was on the west side of the county, north of Callahan, a little place called Dial now. But back then it was inland, and as I mentioned, the Union troops took over Fernandina, and the county tax rolls was in Callahan. So guess what you need to collect taxes? You need to know who owned the land. So in 1864, a regiment of Union soldiers sailed up Lofton Creek, Nassau River, Lofton Creek, and got to the railroad trestle and marched their way from Lofton Creek to Callahan, and then turned northward to along the Kings Road. There was a road there called the Kings Road before the war, and arrested the county clerk at the time, John Higginbottom. And by the time John Higginbottom had buried the records in the swamp. So they forced them, I guess I don't know how they forced them, but he forced Mr. Higginbottom to go show them where the records were. So they got the records and marched back, and of course they arrested John, took him back to Fernandina, and they went through all the records, and all the ones that who most people had already abandoned. Since of course you can't pay your taxes, and so a lot of their land got lost. They lost their land. Daniel Callahan, I mentioned, that owned 26 lots in Fernandina, and David Yulee and Mr. Broom and a couple of others, 7, I call it the Big 7, they lost their land for taxes, because you can't pay taxes, and also for desertion too as well. My Park, so now we're across the railroad. We're about where O'Neill would be today. I guess when the Confederates left Mealy Island, they camped out right across the bridge there in O'Neill, and called Camp Mississippi, and early on in the war. By the end of 1862, they were needed to other states because Union had the island, and there wasn't much going on in Florida, so they decided, well, we need you elsewhere. So there was a small military camp on the railroad there across the trestle there, about where O'Neill was today. And things that happened post-war, well, 1867, John Muir, you heard of John Muir? All right. His first trek, which got him started, was from Indiana, his home place. He walked down to Savannah in 1867, and what happened 3 years prior to that, in 1864, from Atlanta to Savannah? Sherman. So he mentions in the devastation. Of course, by then it had started to recover, but he got to walk in the path of Sherman 3 years before. So he writes a little bit about that. But he gets to Savannah and says, "I'm not gonna walk." If you ever been to Savannah on 95, you cross every 5 miles an inlet or a marsh or a river or a creek or whatever. And he says, "I'm not walking through that." He said, "I'm a hiker, but I'm not enthusiastic about that." So he takes a sailboat from Savannah to Fernandina and gets off, and he walks. He writes a little bit about Fernandina too. It's pretty neat. So if you check out his book, I think it's 1,000-mile walk to the coast, or to the Gulf, excuse me. So if you get a chance, it's online. I think it's on the Sierra Club, which he started the Sierra Club, and he's the father of our national parks. But his first walk was, like I said, to Savannah, and then from Fernandina, walked the railroad down to Cedar Key. So he wrote about the flora and the fauna and stuff. Of course, the Callahan Station was there. He didn't mention that, but he mentions Gainesville. But when he got to Cedar Key, he got ill and had to convalesce that winter in Cedar Key. Then he went on to Havana out west, and then he fell in love with sequoias, and the rest was history. On the right, there's a survey of the destruction of the railroad and how many tracks were missing, and the drawbridge in Fernandina and stuff like that. And that is young John Muir. Don't look like Tim Tebow with a beard? Looks like Tim Tebow with a beard. Tim Tebow. Yeah. Now I mentioned a little bit about Callahan having a dispute with David Yulee. Callahan says, "You owe me money," and David Yulee said, "No, I don't." So Callahan took it upon himself to get collateral. Always get collateral when you get the loan. So he came down in 1871 and took one of Yulee's train engines in Baldwin and was going to drive it to Fernandina. I don't know what he was going to do with it, but he drove it to Fernandina, and the people in the railroad yard got wind of it, and they got one of the tracks out of line, and the train went into mud. It took them a while to get out of the mud, but they arrested the person who did that. So the marshal, he either got his money or he got something out of David Yulee, but they weren't on good terms toward the end there. 1874, which ironically is 150 years ago. There's a canoeist called Nathaniel Bishop, and he, like Muir, instead of walking, Nathaniel Bishop canoed or rowed down the Atlantic coast of America, and he wanted to find the passage from the St. Mary's River to the Gulf. He said that he's heard rumors you can do that, and so he gets to Fernandina and he asked these people, "Where's the passage, to the Gulf?" And they looked at him like he fell off a turnip truck, and so he went upstream a little bit. Of course, if you canoed going upstream, it's not very smart. So he got a hold of David Yulee, and David Yulee said, "Listen here, we will take you by train to south of Callahan, a little place called Dutton." And he let off Dutton, that's the closest point one of the closest points to St. Mary's River. So he hauled on my train with his canoe, and they walked from Dutton to the river and then sailed or canoed downstream, which is a lot easier than going upstream. And he writes a lot about Traders Hill and a lot about Orange Bluff. So if you get a chance, get the book. I'm sure it's here somewhere. The Voyage of the Paper Canoe. That was the name of his canoe there. So get a chance of that. So happy 150th anniversary. Milepost 5 through milepost 9. O'Neill, Bakerville, Nassau, and Lofton. O'Neill is named after Spanish land grants who owned the land that had a plantation north, I guess it would be Barnwell Road. And named after them, yes.
You mentioned Barnwell Road. So who is Barnwell Road named after?
I think, but I found a Barnwell there in the Confederate, thing. So I'm gonna say yes, it's named after him.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
that's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about Bakerville, but Nassau was briefly. Of course, the railroad didn't go to Nassauville, so they had to move the mail somehow. So I think they made that station named after Nassau for briefly. O'Neill, I mentioned. Now you notice one thing about O'Neill is the spelling. O'Neill is O-N-E-A-L, but the map says O-N-E-I-L. You're only as good as your map maker. Ratliff, South Carolina, the same way. The guy's name was Ratcliffe, R-A-T-C-L-I-F-F. Well, the map maker wrote it down as Ratliff, and all the rest is history. So as you're going down the road, you have several stops there. Milepost 15, Harts Road and Yulee. As I mentioned, Harts Road. Harts was the name of the road. Isaiah Hart, there you go, moved to Georgia from Kings Ferry and then saw potential of starting businesses in Calford, which is now called Jacksonville. So he built a road from St. Mary's, Georgia to Jacksonville called the Harts Road, roughly Main Street, Highway 17. Follows it. We have Harts Road here in Yulee, and there's a Harts Road, and part of that is in Jacksonville as well. So when he built the station there, they named it after the road, Harts Road. I say Hart, of course, there's David Lee. When the railroad expanded in 1893, they wanted to honor David Yulee, so they changed the name from Harts Road to Yulee. And there's the train of Yulee Depot, and there's a picture of one of the spirits of special trains that went coming down. It's not 76 train, it's like a steam engine train. I mentioned also Milepost 15, there was also a Civil War camp here for a while called Camp Cooper, named after the general. And in 1881, Harts Road became a junction. Yulee had a second railroad, David Yulee, called the Fernandina in Jacksonville. He wanted to connect Jacksonville to Fernandina. He wanted to pull away a lot of their business from Jacksonville to Fernandina. So he built a railroad. He built it to Yulee, became a junction there. And in 1893, they extended it to Savannah. And so David Yulee's got railroad went all the way up to Columbia, South Carolina. And they wanted to honor David Yulee. He died in I think 1886, so they want to honor him. So they called it Yulee, and for the rest of its history there, Yulee. And a little bit about the Fernandina and Jacksonville Railroad, David Yulee's other railroad. It's part of it actually is still there. The railroad that follows Main Street into Jacksonville is the Fernandina and Jacksonville. Opened about the same time as the other railroad in Callahan, which we'll get to shortly. And there's a picture of the depot and the platform there. When they changed the name to Yulee, or honor Yulee, in 1893. So we're moving past Yulee now. At a town called Hero, Italia, Whitsville, Uncle Jack, and the crossing of the Cummer logging trim. Milepost 21, Italia, you had to have a marker. William McWilliams' ancestors put up the marker. Uncle Jack was named after the postmaster, Andrew Jackson. If you notice, Italia faded, and then there's Uncle Jack that comes up and it fades, and then you have Whitsville all in the same area, and one was a sawmill, one was a turpentine still. But if you notice, a lot of them were postmasters, and postmasters get to fill out the form for the post office. Well, if you're going to be a postmaster, why not name it after yourself? So most of them named Uncle Jack as Jackson Nickenbottom, and then Whitsville's after Whittemore. I'm up 23. Y'all heard the Cummer Gallery in Jacksonville? Well, if you go there and ask about the Cummer Railroad, they're going to look at you funny. So the family came down about 1900. There were timber barons. They came down and bought a lot of land in Nassau County, and that's where that's where Rainer got most of their land. When Rainer came down in the mid 1930s, it was from the Cummer family. They had a logging railroad from Hilliard to Dinsmore, which Dinsmore's in Jacksonville, and it crossed the Florida Railroad there. And it lasted about 30 years, and then they sold out, as I mentioned, to Rainier. So most of the land that Rainier owned and bought in the 1930s were owned by the Cummer family. Peachtree Junction and the Growth Bypass. And the Growth Bypass was the biggest change since Florida Railroad since the construction. They built it in the 1920s. It's that line. Here's Yulee and here's Callahan. It's a straight line here from little turpentine town Growth. There's Georgia there. So as the Seaboard Main Line trains would come down, they could take this to Baldwin instead of going to Jacksonville. Why do you think that was so significant? If you had a rival railroad, and what do you have to do to get better than your rival railroad?
Shorter distance.
Yeah, you gotta be quicker than them. I mean, the Seaboard and Atlantic both start in Richmond, and they both were vying for the same tourists. And they both, the lines intertwined through for Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia, Florida. And at that time, Jacksonville was the biggest city in Florida, and it was also the most congested city. You go in there, you can't go very fast. You have to pull into the Union Terminal. You have to wait for a track to open. Why not go ahead and build a beeline? Because the Seaboard's main line follows 301. If you go 301 out Stark or whatever, that's the main line of Seaboard, whereas the Atlantic main line is 17 in the Green Cove and Orlando. So that was a beeline shot, no curves whatsoever. 20-mile long bypass called the Growth Bypass, still there. You always hear once in a while talk about it turning into a trail. It does go through a wildlife management area. I think the biggest concern about was people riding up and down through a wildlife management area and somebody wearing an antler hat or a Target t-shirt or something.
Is that railroad still operating with trains? Does that railroad still have trains?
No. Growth line.
There's one that goes through Briceville and it has
Yeah,
trains.
right. Yeah, that's the main. Actually, that's the CSX main line now. That's still there. That's part of the original 1856. But this line is gone, and this line is gone. We'll get the guy. Yeah, this replaced that. So once that was built in the 20s, in the 50s, they said, well, why do we have this anymore? So in the 1950s, they took up part of the original Florida Railroad from Yulee to Callahan. If you want to see, there's still remnants of it. If you go low tide, about 2 miles west of 95, there's a little creek called Plummer's Creek, right where you turn. And of course, you do it safely, of course, but because if you look there, or you can pull off of there, and on low tide, you can still see the trestle pylons. When you take up a bridge, you just take the top part off and leave the pylon. The pylon's still there, so on low tide, you can see it. So that's the original Florida Railroad, and you still see some of the rail bed too, as well, but that's the most obvious thing there as well. But when they built the Growth in the 20s and the 50s, that became redundant. So Yulee to Callahan, A1A was pulled up. Growth is named after James Growth, or J.H. Growth, yeah, James, and it was a little turpentine community. It's still there as well. There's a church there as well, and a couple little houses there. Peachtree Junction was named after the Peachtrees. Now we're right now just east of Callahan. Peachtree Junction, named after the Peachtree family. Milepost 27, we're here in Callahan now. It was like before the war, called Callahan Station, and it's shortened to Callahan as well. It was a gateway to Florida from 1881 to 1900 when Henry Plant, y'all heard of Henry Plant? Henry Plant is to the west coast of Florida, as Henry Flagler is to the east coast. Henry Plant was about 20 years 20 years before David Flagler, and so he built a railroad, and he was the first to build a railroad into Florida, a major railroad, and it came through Nassau County, and they did a silver spike just north of Callahan, in between Callahan and Hilliard. But at the time, it came in at a curve right here, and for about 300 yards, we had parallel tracks, and you had two depots side by side. They were rivals. They weren't friendly. They were rivals. They probably, did tons out and little signs up, and I know we are. I know what are you, or some kind of derogatory back in the 1880s. And that lasted until they straightened out the tracks until 1905. The track to where it is now, but before it had a big, and I mentioned the only thing you offer is speed. In 1905, Atlantic Coastline said, well, we got to do something to beat Seaboard. So they double tracked a lot of their tracks, and they straightened up a lot of those curves, so they got rid of this curve here. So this is the picture of the curve here, and that depot is where we're based at today, a different location. That's the 1881 depot, and that's a Civil War depot, which unfortunately got destroyed in the hurricane of '96, 2 years prior to the one that hit Fernandina. There was one that hit the west side of the county and destroyed that one. It still stood a little bit and used as storage. Whoops. There you go. I mentioned Henry Plant in the Savannah, Florida Western. He was the first railroad, that's the first major link. There was the one before this one. This is the first major link into Florida. He connected all the north and the Midwest, and they all came into on that railroad there. And so for a while, Callahan was a gateway by both people coming into Florida and produce and goods leaving Florida. Callahan was a pretty bustling town for about 30 years. There's Henry Plant. And if you ever go to Tampa, I think Tampa College or Tampa University, one of those colleges down there in downtown, that's one of his hotels. And if you've ever been to the Flagler Motel, the Breakers, or the two ones in St. Augustine, you can compare that to the one they built in Tampa for Henry Plant. It's pretty neat. It's the only one I know of that's still standing that Plant built. So I think it's Tampa College, I believe. I mentioned Callahan as a gateway to Florida for about 30 years. I mean, you had presidents coming down. They would come the railroad in. You had tourists. You also had a duel. I mentioned the two depots were right side by side, and they didn't like each other. Well, one was a constable of Callahan in the 1880s, and he had to arrest one of the workers for the other railroad. And so it was on a Friday night, he arrested him, he got out on bail, whatever. And so the next day, the guy who got arrested was coming back to give the constable his comeuppance. And they had a duel. He had duels back then. Y'all know Hamilton. He had duels back then, and they shot at the same time. I don't think it was a formal one. I think what it is when the guy came up on him, the other guy pulled his gun and said, "Well, if you shoot me, you're gonna." Anyway, what happened was they shot at the same time, and they both got hit by the other person's bullet, and they both died. Sad, but now usually you hit at one or the other, not both. So. They were deadly rivals. I mentioned calendar of the war. Now, after when the Confederates pulled up most of the tracks in 1864 to move the iron elsewhere, Yulee, who was a pro-secessionist and slave owner, said, "You're not taking my rails." So it took 2 years for them to finally build it. And so they took the rails and moved them to Live Oak to build a link to the other Confederate states. So Daniel Callahan, who laid those rails in 1856, ironically got to lay the rails in 1864, so the same rails, ironically. It was too late though. The war was practically over with at the time. But you had several, in 1864, Jacksonville was under Union control. You had Fernandina under Union control. So Callahan was the end of the line for the Florida Railroad, and so they made him a target. There's several skirmishes in Callahan that the troops would march up the Florida Railroad and attack and burn some houses and take the train cars. So Callahan and Fernandina is one of the few spots I know of that had Revolutionary War skirmishes and Civil War skirmishes at the same time. You're not going to find that in Florida. It's very rare. So keep that in mind. Then we're moving down from Callahan. Callahan, Crawford, Tahoma, Dutton, Verde, and Ingalholm. And each one of those, one was in William Crawford. And by 1900, it became a railroad junction for another railroad, not the Seaboard or Norfolk Southern today. But back then it was called the Savannah, Florida. It's called the Atlantic and Atlantic, Valdosta, and Western. Tahoma, probably named after Hilliard and Bailey's Lumber Company. I mentioned Dutton. You'll see Dutton shortly. That's named after a sawmill owner. And then Verde was named after the founder of Cerncy's daughter. And that's a good example of a town being 20 years, one name, fading away, coming back under another name as well. Ingalholm is possibly named by the Davis brothers or by George Bryce's son, who owned land there. But couldn't find anything about Ingalholm. I didn't know how that came from. There's your turpentine were being loaded in barrels onto the train. And I love that picture there. That's in Verde. That's the Howard family. And people talk about not having the engineering skills. Look at that roof line. It's incredible how straight those roofs and the house. They built that probably by hand. And you think people being primitive or whatever back in the day, not having Google to show you how to build stuff. It's incredible how that roof line is. I mentioned Atlantic, Valdosta, and Western. That came in from the west, from Atlantic, from Macon. And that line is still there. Most of Florida is served by the CSX, but there is a Norfolk Southern line goes into Florida. It mainly just connects to the FEC. They have a deal where FEC, which goes down to Miami, will haul Norfolk Southern's trains and vice versa. Now we're down to mile post 41, St. Mary's Station. When the railroad first came in, they called it St. Mary's because it was one of the closest points to the St. Mary's River. Then it was called Brandy Branch after that. You notice it's Brandy Branch. And then, in parentheses, Bryceville, PO. So it just named Bryceville back in the day. And there's George Bryce. And I mentioned the postmasters. And George Bryce owned at least 10,000 acres from the railroad to the river. So he had turpentine stills, he had logging camps, he was a Confederate veteran, and it's incredible. His house, his second house, built in 1902, is still standing. It's on private property, but you can go up to the railroad tracks and look at it. It's incredible how the house is. It's still
in Bryceville?
In Bryceville, yeah, Bryce House. Go turn down Church Avenue, go by the school, and there's Bryce Church, the Bryce Cemetery, and then across the streets is the house. You can still, three-bedroom house, but it's private property across the street, so be careful of them across the railroad track, but you can still go pull into the cemetery and look at it. It's a beautiful house. And it's still got the water tower, too. But that was the old Bryceville depot there. Probably a lot of, like I said, George Bryce had turpentine, and you had lumber, and so you needed a depot. Oh, there's the house right there. Okay, there you go. It's still standing there. Beautiful house. 1902. Florida Railroad today, it still plays important parts. Not a national railroad per se, but trains still follow the old path from Fernandina to Yulee. And now from Callahan to Bryceville onward is the main line of CSX. CSX sold their tracks in Orlando. The main line used to go from Jacksonville to Orlando, but CSX, 15 years ago, sold their tracks to the state of Florida so Orlando could build their rapid transit trains. So CSX can only run their trains at night. So a lot of the trains now go on to called the S line down to Bryceville. That's why Bryceville gets more trains now, in case you didn't know that, because of that one reason. So in fact, that's Bryceville right there on the right. standing on the road there, which I don't recommend. Don't stand on the tracks. There was a disclaimer there. And one reason I get a little tangent. Do you know why? Well, you don't. There's no reason why, but you used to hear a train coming from a while back. The clickety clack of the track. Well, tracks now are half-mile long. They're one section. They're not different sections. So a train can, and they're also electric and not diesel. So it's very hard to hear one. So anyway, disclaimer okay, on that. Whoops. Oh, there you go. A little about the Historical Society. We were established in 1975, so next year we have our golden anniversary there coming up, 50 years. We are a nonprofit group. There's actually us in front of the Italia marker that's put up about 10 years ago. We meet on the fourth Thursday of each month from January to October. We have ice cream social classes, whatever, and also we have a Smithsonian Institute exhibit coming up too as well, called Nassau Plus Food. So we are, and if you're interested in getting interviewed for that, of how food influences culture, what's your memories about food, you remember any gatherings, is there a special food that you have to have at a gathering? We'd be glad to interview for our exhibit in 2026. Shameless plug here. Anyway, 2012 I did write a book about Daniel Callahan, and I do have his uniform, which actually, y'all seen the movie The Santa Claus with Tim Allen? Yeah. Where he turns into Santa Claus. Well, actually 12 years, I had hair and I was lean and fit, and I'm turning into Daniel Callahan because the only description, he was a portly man. So I'm turning into Daniel Callahan. But anyway, I do play him in birthday parties and bar mitzvahs, so come see me afterwards. But anyway, I do have a uniform. But anyway, so Daniel Callahan was a prolific, he just didn't build a Florida railroad. He built railroads in about 12 states and about 3 countries. When I wrote the book, I didn't know, we were looking for a photograph, and our tagline was, we started out looking for a photograph. We ended up finding snapshots of his life. So we didn't ever, and we still haven't found a photograph of him, although we found the script from him, and we haven't found a photograph. But we found more information after the book, so I'm doing a little addendum, probably about 20 pages long, in addition to the book as well. So I do have it in my shameless plug here. But anyway, I do donate $2 back to the Historical Society as well. So if anyone's interested in buying a book, come see me, or if interested in getting on a newsletter, let us know. We got pins up here, or if anybody's interested in being interviewed, either video or audio, about food, plus Nassau County and how it influences our culture, to let me know. We love to. The Smithsonian is a Nassau County exhibit by the Florida Humanities and Smithsonian, so we covered the whole county, not just Callahan. So we're looking forward to finding out the history of shrimping and stuff, and getting people, what's your favorite seafood. So anyway, any questions? Yes, sir.
I've always been kind of confused, or at least ignorant, about Henry Flagler coming south, and obviously ended up at St. Augustine first. What tracks did he use? Did he build his own railroad independent of all of these?
Yeah, Henry Flagler built. He bought a railroad. It was a railroad from Jacksonville to, I want to say, Daytona and St. Augustine. Actually, first from Jacksonville to St. Augustine. That's why the headquarters is in St. Augustine of the FEC, which is Florida East Coast, which is Flagler's railroad. He wanted to come down, and he knew he wanted to build tourist hotels along the East Coast. He knew by then you had to bring them down, so why not build a railroad and bring them down? That's why every town he went to further south had a hotel. I mentioned the 2 in St. Augustine are still standing, actually. I mentioned City Hall in St. Augustine, one of them, and Flagler College is the other one. I mentioned the Breakers in West Palm Beach. That's still available for tours. I'm not sure if there's any more standing, but yeah, he built his own railroad.
Did he build anything in Nassau County?
No, Henry Flagler did not.
Okay.
No, he started in Jacksonville.
Were these railroads in Nassau County mostly used to deliver goods and merchandise? They were passenger railroads or what?
Most with Fernandina, the part of it was passenger and goods, up to probably 1900 when the automobile became, and then roads. The Dixie Highway was built in 1915. You had the old Shell Road. I guess by it took days. It took a day to get across the St. Mary's River until they actually built a bridge. So if you was driving a car, it took a day just to get across on the ferry, on Kolar's Ferry. You know, so I mean, you guess you had to, and then you can probably only go 20 miles an hour from here to, so traveling by car from, let's say, Illinois to here was probably a chore up until probably they actually started paving the roads. In fact, it was the Dixie Highway Association that got the first bridge over the St. Mary's River built, because they just got tired of people waiting there for a whole day. Yes, ma'am.
The Davis brothers that you mentioned with the sawmill and the turpentine, is that the same Davis family that has been donating all the land for the Mayo Clinic?
I don't think so. I think that is Nocatee, right? In talking Duval County, that where they are. Yeah, I don't think they may be related. This Davis family, Nassau County, he's still around. Clyde Davis. You don't know Clyde Davis? He's retiring this year. In fact, that's his family. Mizell's and they're on a lot. They own land in Crandall and Kings Ferry, Orange Bluff, all along the river there. A big timber family. And also, I mentioned Inglehome, the Davis brother. That was the same, either a cousin or the same, but they own land in that area too, north of Bryceville. Yes.
Can't see behind me if I'm
No, I think we're
breaking in
okay.
line.
No.
So at some point though, Amtrak did start doing, including this
Yes.
area on their route. How did that happen, and did they utilize any of the old lines, or did they do kind of like?
Yes.
work on and start
Well, they
doing-
utilize, in fact, they still utilize
Yeah, they still. do.
private railroads today, other than we call it the Northeast Corridor, which they own. The Amtrak owns from Washington to Boston, but other tracks they lease or rent or whatever to CSX. That happened in the mid '70s when the Amtrak took over, and that's when they built that. Jackson moved out, which I think is a mistake. They moved out of the Prime Osborne Center, which was the Union Terminal. They moved out of there and built that little station there off of Edgewood Avenue, which is, hopefully they'll move back, because it's a shame that, you have a major town and to have that kind of a depot there. But in the mid '70s, yeah. And so they never just stopped. Most of the railroads weren't making money from passenger trains by that time anyway, so they were happy. I think the only railroad I mentioned was Crescent Limited from New Orleans to Washington. The only train I know of that was probably on Amtrak. But they stopped all the stops in Nassau County. I think the closest stop north is what, Jessup and Savannah, and then Jacksonville, and then Palaca. Any more questions? Good.